Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, no matter where you're watching from. We're so glad you're here. Welcome to America at a Crossroads. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, and me. A special welcome to our remarkable guests, Miguel Santana, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, and David Leonhardt, and to our moderator, Patt Morrison. Tonight's program, Rights, Raids, and Reckonings, ICE and America's Immigration Crossroads, could not be more timely or urgent. Before we delve into today's topic, we want to acknowledge the news of the last 24 hours out of the Middle East. We wait with great anticipation for the release of the hostages who were taken on October 7th, 2 years ago. And we also welcome what we hope will be the end of the war that has cost tens of thousands of lives. We hope that this is the first step towards a permanent peace for all in the region. For those new to our audience, America at a Crossroads is a project of Jews United for Democracy and Justice, founded in 2017 in response to President Trump's first Muslim travel ban, a profoundly offensive attack on both American and Jewish values. We launched this weekly town hall series in 2020 and have now produced more than 300 programs featuring leading voices on the critical issues facing our democracy: voting rights, academic freedom, the rule of law, and more. Among those issues, few strike closer to the heart of our mission than immigration, the way we as a nation treat those who seek safety and opportunity within our borders. As a Jewish American organization, we are guided by our deepest values: dignity, justice, and compassion. When masked officers acting on behalf of the government raid homes or workplaces, arresting people based on appearance, accent, or origin, we know that this is not just cruel, it is inconsistent with both American and Jewish ideals. We are especially troubled by the Supreme Court's recent decision in Nome versus Vasquez-Perdomo, which effectively allowed roving patrols by immigration agents, permitting stops based on ethnicity, language, or neighborhood. That ruling legitimizes racial profiling. Our tradition teaches us the opposite. The Torah commands us, "You shall not oppress the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Every human being deserves to be treated with dignity and compassion. Those are the values that animate our work and tonight's conversation. This program is co-sponsored by a remarkable coalition of organizations: California Community Foundation, TRUA, the Breed Street Shul Project, PICO California, ECAR, PICO Union Project, Holocaust Museum LA, Beit Tzedek, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, JVS SoCal, and ABC Alliance for a Better Community. We thank all of these organizations for standing with us, and we stand with each of these organizations in the shared pursuit of justice and humanity. We give a special shout out and thanks to Robin Kramer, whose vision helped bring this program to life. Before we begin, a quick preview of what is ahead for America at a Crossroads. In the next 2 weeks, we have two Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists with us in our next two programs. Next Wednesday, October 15th, from 5 to 6 p.m. Pacific, Ann Applebaum of The Atlantic will be in conversation with Madeline Brand on the topic Autocracy, Inc., The Siege on Democracy. And the following week, on October 22nd, Linda Greenhouse, who has covered the U.S. Supreme Court for the New York Times for the past 3 decades, will be in conversation with Patt Morrison on the topic Law, Politics, and Power, Perspectives on the Supreme Court. You can register for all of our upcoming programs through the follow-up email you will receive tonight or by visiting JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to tonight's moderator, Patt Morrison, a multi-award-winning journalist, author, and longtime Los Angeles Times columnist. Patt is a treasure to us at America at a Crossroads. She is one of the rare journalists whose brilliance spans both the written word and the spoken one. Patt, the program is yours.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you all for watching, for joining us on this important evening on this important topic, and to all those who've helped out with sponsoring and supporting us in our ability to bring these programs to you. We have a 90-minute program tonight, so there'll be plenty of time for you to put your questions to us, and we will put them to our panelists. You see the Q&A box there at the bottom of the screen. You can tell us your first name and where you're from. We'd like to be able to bring that to people as well. As you know, in human history, the world over, we have had really two kinds of immigrants and refugees, and the Venn diagram tends to cross over with both. There are those who are running away from something, like civil war and persecution, genocide, environmental disasters, and climate change, as we're beginning to see now. And those people who are going towards something. And so often in the United States, that has meant opportunities, jobs, religious and political freedom. And now we see the United States, this legendary land built for and by immigrants, targeting people for deportation, as Janice said, not only by criminal records or immigration status, but by color, language, demeanor, line of work. In fact, just about anything that the people who are picking them up choose to describe as suspicious. There are immense implications in this country for the economy, for politics, for immigrant communities of every stripe, and let's face it, for the peace of the American character and the nature of the American soul and its mission in the world. So we're joined by three guests who can all speak to that. David Leonhardt is the editorial director of the New York Times, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and the author of Ours Was the Shining Future, the story of the American dream, which argued that since the mid-1970s, the American economic system has failed and that present-day Americans might find themselves not economically better off than their parents. Rabbi Jill Jacobs is the CEO of Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. It's an organization that trains and mobilizes more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors and their communities to bring a moral voice to protecting and advancing human rights in North America, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territories. She's the author of Where Justice Dwells, a hands-on guide to doing social justice in your Jewish community. Thank you for joining us as well. And Miguel Santana is president and CEO of the California Community Foundation. For those of you who don't know it, it's one of Southern California's largest philanthropies, with more than $2 billion in assets and nearly 2,000 charitable legatees. He's also been the city administrative officer for the city of LA and originally a community liaison for a group you probably have heard of called MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Miguel, I'd like to start with you and maybe go by the numbers a little bit. You and I have known each other for a long time, so I can call you
Indeed,
Miguel.
of course.
What kind of breakdowns are we seeing in who ICE has been picking up in terms of countries of origin? I will emphasize criminal records because we heard from Donald Trump that he's only going after the worst of the worst. Where people are being found, their ages, the demographics, what kind of jobs they've been doing. Do you have a breakdown on that so we know where we're starting?
Certainly, and I'm going to focus on Los Angeles County because that really is where the campaign started, as we all know, in June. It really it started here because in many ways we are the epicenter of the undocumented community. We are a county of 10 million people. 1 out of 10 people here are undocumented. It is a well-established community. 2/3 of the people who are undocumented have been in Los Angeles for more than 10 years. 20% of the population are homeowners. There are people who've been here for a very long time. They are part of the economy. 1 of 4 children in this county live with one parent who are undocumented. So this is not just an issue that impacts part of the population. It impacts many, many families in the region. And so when the campaign started here in LA, it was very clear that the intention of the administration was to target a community that has been integrated into the fabric, into the economy, into the culture of this region. So focusing on the numbers. So from June to August, of the 1 million people that live here who are undocumented, only 4,163 people have been arrested. Now, that number is interesting because you wouldn't imagine that given all of the drama, given all of the fear, given all the deterioration of our civil rights and all of the precedent setting, the unmasked men, as was stated earlier, the new establishment of norms, including, as was earlier said, now basically legalizing racial profiling, where the federal government can literally grab people on the street based on their appearance, based on their language, based on how they dress, based on their work. I and many Latinos that I know in Los Angeles now walk around with our passports because we are concerned that at any point we could be detained. My parents, who've been here since the 1960s, are afraid to go outside of their home, as are many people whom I know. Now, the important thing, as you stated, the administration started this campaign with a commitment to go after the worst of the worst. 70% of the people detained have no criminal record. And of those, 57 have never been charged with any single crime. And so, in fact, the worst of the worst are not being detained. These are individuals who are hardworking folks who have been part of this community for a very long time. Now, in contrast, it's important to state these facts that in 2012, under a different administration, in that year, there were 410 deportations, one of the largest deportation years in the country's history, even greater than what was experienced.
410?
410,000.
Okay.
410,000 deportations, including in the year of 1929 and 1930, when my grandparents, who had moved from central Mexico to Michigan, had lived there for 10 years, were rounded up and sent back to central Mexico nearly 100 years ago. Of those, 55% under a different administration were in fact criminal convictions. And that was done without mass men. That was done without an unprecedented investment in what we've seen, $170 billion investment that the Congress has made to enforcement that hasn't even started trickling in, and without the deterioration of basic fundamental rights that we have enjoyed in this country. So we are in a very important moment in our country's history. And so the question that I think we need to talk about is really trying to understand, what is this really about? Because if in Los Angeles, if you take it as a microcosm, given all of the focus and all of the attention that was placed, seeing military in MacArthur Park, as an example, to only generate 4,000 arrests. What is this really about? And what it has really created is really a campaign of fear among a community that is afraid to go to the doctor, afraid to send their kids to school, afraid to go to work, at a time where our economy is barely holding on. And so you see it when you walk through the city, you see it in construction sites. I hear from people who are trying to rebuild their homes in the Palisades in Altadena. This is having a significant impact on the way of life, not just in Los Angeles, but throughout the country.
So you just mentioned some things I'm going to David Leonhardt about, and then I will get to Rabbi Jacobs on some of the human rights issues that underpin this so forcefully. David Leonhardt, there are political questions that you're good on that I'd like to get to in a bit. But first of all, there are the economic issues. I remember back in the 1990s when we had a lot of changes in our immigration policy. And senators on both sides of the aisle, Dianne Feinstein and also Republican senators, were saying, look, our constituents, our growers, our agriculture people are saying, we don't have anybody to pick the crops. The apple crop up in the Pacific Northwest was going to rot. Now we're seeing, as Mr. Santana was saying, people who aren't showing up at jobs at construction sites, people who aren't showing up at work at restaurants because they are afraid. Before we get a little later into the politics, can you speak about the economic repercussions of what we were seeing? We see small numbers of arrests, but the impact, as the administration intended in some ways and perhaps not in others, is immense.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to very briefly echo Miguel's comments and yours, Pat's, about how alarming so much of this is from a civil liberties perspective and a constitutional and a legal perspective. I'm not going to go into detail because other folks have covered it, but I just want to say the idea that we have deported people to a terrible foreign prison without any due process, the idea that it is okay to racially profile people, the notion that so many Latinos and Latinas in our country now, as Miguel is, are carrying passports because they're worried about this. The levels of violation of the law and of basic decency and of American values and frankly American interests that the Trump administration has done on immigration is really alarming. I think one of the things that it's important to do is that for people who are very proud of America's immigration history, which I am, and I'm guessing many people listening tonight are, to ask themselves, how is it that we got to a place in which the American public was so fed up with the situation that they were willing to elect someone who promised this immigration agenda? We'll get to more of that in the politics, but it feeds right into the economics, which is immigration, like many things, has both economic benefits and economic costs. And I think for a long time, what has happened is that people who are relatively insulated from the economic downsides of immigration, people like journalists, like me, professors, have basically tried to sell the American people on this notion that immigration is a free lunch, that it's only good. And the fact is that it's both. And so what are the economic effects of what we're seeing? It will raise prices. It will raise prices because it will be harder for businesses to find workers who can then do those jobs. But let's flip that around. Part of the reason it will raise prices is that those businesses will then have to raise the wages of the workers they have because the labor pool will be smaller than it otherwise will have been. And so when we think about the economic effects, one of the things that I think it's really important to say is that for a long time, not just in the United States, but in Europe, relatively privileged people have lectured working class people and have said, you're wrong. You're wrong to have any concerns about immigration. It's actually in your economic interests. And it's much more complicated than that. Immigration has economic benefits, but it has economic costs. And you can look at studies that say that, but I actually think there's a nice little example that shows it. I'm guessing we have some doctors in the audience, some MDs. You cannot, as an immigrant doctor, simply come into this country and prove that you are qualified to practice medicine in order to do it. There are many more barriers to practicing medicine in this country. For immigrants, the classic thing that immigrants have to do is they actually have to train here first. Why would doctors do that? They would do it because they understand that having large numbers of immigrants come into an industry lowers the pay of the people in that industry. And doctors have the political power to basically make sure that we can restrict the flow. And so when we think of the economics, I would encourage everyone to keep in mind that it really does have economic costs. And I think on net, those costs are larger than the benefits for people. But if working class people look at this situation or look at the very high immigration of the past few years and said, you know what, I'm uncomfortable with immigration in part because it can hold my wages down. It can hold my wages down in the construction industry, in the restaurant industry. They're right about that. And I think it's important that we not sort of lecture them and tell them that immigration, unlike almost anything else, is a free lunch with only economic benefits.
Well, let me push on one question, which is that the lifestyle and things that middle class and even working class Americans enjoy now. I'm thinking of Donald Trump saying, well, your kid will have to be happy with $2 instead of 30, which is, of course, an exaggeration. It's like, will a car wash pay people $30 an hour to do the job? We've already seen construction sites slow down and shut in Los Angeles. There have been suggestions that Medicare recipients go out and replace farm workers in the field. So I'm wondering if in the long term, yes, maybe wages will rise. People will live with fewer amenities in the meantime or fewer benefits. But is there not going to be what we're already seeing, which is a serious economic cost to rebuilding in the fire zones, for example, here in Los Angeles, because the tariffs have already hit us with a double whammy on that, or just the kind of work that gets done that people need to have done in the course of their lives. And I'm not talking about, fancy manicures or getting your car, finished every 3 months. I'm talking about the things that make life possible in part because of immigrant labor in this country.
It will have those effects. but it also will raise the wages of people in many lower income professions. I mean, just to take an example, right? Imagine that you wanted to build a new room on your house, and there were many fewer people who were available to do that kind of work. You would have to pay the people who are doing it more. And in a way, that is a transfer of money from the relatively affluent person who owns the house to the less affluent people who are doing the work on it. Whereas if we had a much larger labor pool, it would be less expensive to do. And yes, probably more people could do their houses. So GDP will go up when we have more immigration, but there will be costs. And I think that one of the things that's helpful to think about this is what is the period in our history when working class people and middle class people got the biggest raises? What is the period in our history when the white-black wage gap shrunk the most? I think most of us think about this. We know the answer to that question. It's the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. That was a period of incredibly low immigration in this country, and that's not a total coincidence. The low immigration was not the main reason, may not have even been one of the top three reasons. But the reason I push so hard on this is that we've had this dynamic for a long time where we've had relatively well-off people tell less well-off people, it is in your interest to have really high immigration. And less well-off people have said, it sure doesn't feel that way. And I actually think they are more right than we often give them credit for. So more immigration helps GDP, but it doesn't help everybody in a country. And that is actually the normal thing. Most things that help GDP don't help absolutely everyone. There are distributional effects and trade-offs.
So there are also moral and ethical, and as you alluded to, constitutional costs. And Rabbi Jacobs, there's a slippery slope here, and this is a lesson that is not lost at all on Jews in this country and elsewhere. And in January, after Donald Trump took office, you talk about him suspending the refugee admissions program, ordering mass arrest and deportations of undocumented immigrants, trying to overturn the 14th Amendment with birthright citizenship. So many of these incursions that suggest that that slippery slope that the Lutheran pastor Niemöller referred to, that they came for the Jews and I was not a Jew and I didn't speak up. It feels like we're very speedily heading down that hill. And can you elaborate on that?
Sure, thank you. It's really wonderful to be on this panel, but unfortunate that this is a conversation that we have to have right now. So I want to talk from the Jewish community perspective, and I'll talk in a few different ways. First, I want to go way back and talk about values and talk about Jewish values as it relates to immigrants. Janice already mentioned earlier this idea of treating the stranger, the ger, the sojourner, who is in the biblical taking particular care of how we treat the ger, who's this sojourner. In the biblical context, that's a person who came from somewhere else and now lives here and is kind of in between, right? They have come from somewhere else that they can't go back to, and now they're living in this community. And it's a little too complicated for tonight to get into the specifics of citizenship and that sort of thing in that context. But to say that our commitments to people who are coming from somewhere else and who are not exactly part of the Jewish community, but are part of the Jewish community and the citizenry really go back to the Bible. But even the text that I really want to refer to is the text about the evil cities of Sodom and Amorah, or Sodom and Gomorrah, which in kind of the popular imagination, a lot of people have an idea of why those cities were considered so evil, but actually which I won't mention those ideas, but I'll say that the Jewish concept of why they're so evil is actually because of the way that they treated strangers. There are many, many midrashim or rabbinic stories about the people of Sodom and their treatment toward travelers. So somebody who would come in and nobody would give them food and just wait until they died. And even the people who there's one midrash that gives a story of a young girl who tries to feed somebody who's hungry, and basically she's found out and pretty brutally punished. And so this is the sin of the city that is considered the most evil city, is that the people were cruel to foreigners who are coming and who are traveling there, which we can even see in the Peshat or in the direct text of the biblical story. But just moving ahead, most Jews in this country come from families who came here as immigrants and as refugees. And most of us have family stories of how our families came at some point in history, either fleeing violence, fleeing from Nazi Germany, coming after the Holocaust, coming from other parts of the world, looking for safety here, and very often finding safety. This has been America has been one of the safest places for the Jewish community, really, in Jewish history. And that's one of the reasons that the Jewish community has historically been extremely supportive of immigrants and of immigration. This has been pretty much a consensus issue for decades in the Jewish community, because we have those stories about our families. And also we have stories about Jews who have long been fighting for immigrants, not just for Jewish immigrants, but for all immigrants. We have stories. We know that there were Jews who were involved in the sanctuary movement in the 80s through today. And we also understand that there can't be any separate peace for Jews, that we can't create a situation in which we get rid of anti-Semitism, in which we make America safe for Jews, but not safe for other minority groups. That if we are going to make this country one that's safe for Jews, it has to be safe for all people. We have to make sure that Trump and his folks don't manage to turn this into a country that is only safe for white Christian men, which of course is the fantasy of Trump and of Project 2025. And so the Jewish community by and large understands that it's dangerous for us and for everybody if the United States is not safe for everybody. And I'm sure we'll talk more about how people are responding right now, but I'm the CEO of Trua, which represents more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors across the US and Canada. We have rabbis and cantors in 47 states, certainly including California, including the Los Angeles area, as well as 6 provinces in Canada. And during the first Trump administration, during this administration, in between, our rabbis and their communities have been out there accompanying immigrants to ICE check-ins, helping refugees get settled in their own communities, visiting the border and bring back stories of what's happening there, protesting, et cetera, to try to continue to make this country safe for immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, which of course is becoming harder and harder, as we've already heard.
A little later, we will be putting up some information and links to Trua and other programs that if you want to help, to volunteer, to know more about helping immigrants who are being taken into court, what that process is and what you can do, we'll have those links available for you in the future for the website, the web information, and links here as we go along. Miguel Santana, we're listening to David Leonhardt talking about long-term trade-offs and benefits. And he's saying that we're not speaking to a lot of working class, non-immigrant Americans, and I use that in a narrow sense of immigrants within the last, say, 40 years, and how the economy changes because of their presence, certain benefits, certain drawbacks. Do you want to speak to that, the long-term and short-term, that we have seen, in fact, in the fluctuations over 100-some years of American history as well?
Well, I think it's really about how broken the system is. I think if someone's been in this country for a significant part of their adulthood, here without authorization, has established a family, has been able to buy a home, has been able to maintain a life, in some ways, they're impacted by the more recent arrival who is coming and willing to accept a lower wage than the person who's been here 20, 30 years. And so the very fact that there hasn't been comprehensive immigration reform for decades, that recognizes that this country needs labor, that one of the primary values of this country is the fact that we are a nation of immigrants, has created this system where we're constantly creating winners and losers. And that's felt in the very same neighborhoods that immigrants live in. And so I think that what's unfortunate is that that's not the conversation we're having. That what's not on the table is a way to respond to the way this system is broken. And what's even worse is that for those individuals who are in fact trying to legalize their status, who are going through the process, they're being punished by when they're going to court, they're actually being detained. And so it's actually undermining the very system that we're trying to encourage people to follow. And so I would argue that this is actually not about immigration or about immigrants. When you have invested so significantly in a place like Los Angeles, where you militarize our streets, when you have brought the international attention that has resulted in a decline in tourism in our region, a decline in a very significant way, in a time where we have just experienced these horrific fires. This is about something much bigger. And I think that's really the conversation that as Americans we need to start talking about. And the administration hasn't been shy about starting to telegraph what this is about. Recently, in talking to the leadership of the military, when there's very direct language about using cities as training grounds for the military, or talking about the enemy from within, when focusing on institutions in academia, focusing on philanthropy, focusing on the nonprofit sector, on the independent press. These are about the erosion of basic civil society in a way that is fundamental to this country. I would argue that what's happening to the immigrant community is frankly simply a laboratory for what is a bigger agenda that is starting to reveal itself as time progresses. And I think we should all be concerned about what's to come as the months and years progress.
Miguel, I remember reading years ago, this conference, Cesar Chavez, who was the co-founder of the United Farm Workers Union, with Dolores Huerta, was calling on what was then called the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, to enforce the border, because he was concerned that people coming north would make themselves available for work to growers who had union contracts or who were thinking about union contracts, and undercut the ability of his workers and his union members to negotiate contracts and work at better wages that Mr. Leonhardt was referring to.
That's right. So that again is an example of the broken system where those who are established are basically their quality of life is impacted by the more recent arrivals whose level of desperation is exploited by an economy that is willing to take their labor and their willingness to work at any level. And I think what we should all be concerned about is, where does that go next? Is that instead of creating a system that is designed to be fair and allows for a pathway to citizenship for immigrants through a process, we have in fact facilitated a very broken system where it is not designed around our nation's interests, but rather designed around economic interests, who are the ones that most benefit from the brokenness of that system.
Mr. Leonhardt, he's referring to the broken system and the broken politics, and our immigration policies have been a mess for at least 40 years now, and they've been whiplashed from one administration to the next. And in a little bit, we'll talk about who's advantaged politically and who's not by this. But outside of what we see as a general sense of immigration laws should be supported, however messy they are, and however much they need reform. What we're seeing now is an administration that's operating outside of those laws. That, as Mr. Santana said, if someone has an appointment for a green card, they go into court and they find not a system that's going to say, okay, you've done all your diligence, here is your passport, here's your new status, here's your green card, but hauls them off to prison, and perhaps a prison far away from any place that their friends and relatives know where they are. So there are really two things going on here, are there not?
Yes, there are. And Pat, please call me David, or I'll feel
I'm
guilty
sorry,
about
thank
calling you
you.
Pat. That's absolutely right. And I think the point that Miguel made about just how chilling it is that people who are trying to play by the rules and go in because they have a date as part of their process and then get swept up in it. And further than that, the point that Miguel made is that we should think about this law breaking by the administration as part of a larger picture of law breaking. Immigrants are really in many ways on the sharp end of it, but we see extending to other ways. I mean, just today, Letitia James was indicted in a blatantly political indictment. So I absolutely see that there is, I agree that this is part of a much larger and really worrisome pattern. And Pat, you said there are really two things going on here, and I think that is absolutely right. That there is the really alarming assault on civil liberties and on dignity, and as I said earlier, on what I think are American interests that the Trump immigration policy represents. And then there is the fact that not only do we have a broken immigration system, but I think that there have been a lot of people who have engaged in wishful thinking on immigration. So you have a lot of corporate interests, CEOs, lobbyists who have been in favor of very high immigration because they understand that it holds wages down. And over the last decade or so, you've had the Democratic Party move very far, if you want to say left, although it's the same opinion that Milton Friedman held, to be in favor of much more open immigration. And the Biden administration basically put that policy in place. And it's not just an American story. We've seen huge increases in immigration in Europe and huge backlashes there. Immigration was a major issue in the South Africa election because there was a backlash there. Immigration's been an issue in Australia. It's been an issue all around the world. And so we are living in this age of mass migration. The citizens of most countries that are the recipients of immigrants believe the levels have been too high. And for too long, politicians of the center left and center right, we don't have much of a center right anymore in the United States. The Republican Party is sort of further right than center right. But politicians of the center left and center right have ignored people's concerns about it. And so to me, there is this urgent crisis of how the Trump administration is trampling on the rule of law and really oppressing not only immigrants, but large numbers of Latino and Asian people who are not immigrants. And then there is the longer term thing, which is that the Biden administration and some other governments in other countries like Germany and Sweden were really pursuing unsustainable immigration policies that their own people didn't want. And when we get out of this, we have to try to get to a place that is somewhere in the middle of those two, very far from what Trump is doing, but meaningfully different from the really chaotic and politically damaging and economically chaotic system that the Biden administration permitted.
Rabbi Jacobs, we're talking about these spaces in the middle here. We have, the moral outrages being committed by ICE agents. And then on the other hand, we have a system that at its worst is unresponsive, not only to the needs of immigrants, but to the needs of Americans as well. So ethically, how do you navigate something like this? Because people are outraged by what they're seeing. They're turning out in protest, unexpected people in unexpected places to do this. And yet, on the other hand, there is a system that isn't really addressing anybody's needs adequately.
Thanks. So when I look to Jewish tradition, one of the Jewish tradition is very much about very smart, thoughtful people trying to answer the question of how we build a just world, right? So we know the story of the Israelites come out of Egypt, and it's very dramatic, and they get to Sinai, and there's the giving of the Torah, and that's all very dramatic, and there's thunder and lightning, and et cetera, et cetera. And then the very next thing that happens is they start getting a series of laws that are about how human beings are supposed to treat each other, right? It's no longer like the thunder and the lightning and the drama. It's just really every day. How do you treat your workers? What happens if two people get into a fight? Laws about the immigrant, et cetera, et cetera. And I won't say that Jewish law and Jewish tradition necessarily always give us the right answer to at the moment, right? It's more about asking the right questions. So you can't look at halakha, Jewish law, and say, oh, okay, I understand exactly how to vote on this bill, or I understand how to write an immigration bill. But what you do get is you get a set of principles. And key among them is that we have to create a system that is the most just for the most people and that is based in notions of dignity, starting with the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, which is not just a nice idea, but it actually has to be concretized into law. And so what I'm not going to do is try to sit here today and say, okay, look, we're going to write an immigration bill and here are going to be the specific points in it. And here's the perfect immigration system. I don't know the answer to that. There are lots and lots of smart people who are thinking about it, who have been trying to pass immigration bills, for decades. We haven't had a real comprehensive immigration bill. I think the last time we were serious about it was during the Obama administration. But I think it's really important to ask the right questions. Some of the questions that we've already heard from both Miguel and from David about how do we create an economic system in which everybody can go to work and they don't have to become super wealthy, but make enough money to support their family. How do we create a system in which people who are looking for safety can come into this country? What would be the most fair system? We know it's not the one we have. We know that there's essentially almost no way to come into this country legally unless you have some highly specialized skill for which you now have to pay $100,000 for a visa, which is another issue. But let's actually ask those questions and ask what kind of society we want to create. And that will lead us to asking questions about, well, what should the process be for coming into this country? What is the number of immigrants that we can reasonably absorb into the country? What's our process for asylum seekers? At this point in the Trump administration, the asylum system is virtually closed. The Biden administration was actually not that great, was pretty terrible on asylum also. But what's our responsibility to people who are seeking asylum? What's our responsibility to countries from which people are seeking asylum, often because of long-term policies by the US, right? So let's ask all those questions. And I can't, like I said, I don't know what the end result is, but I think if we really ask those questions as a country at some point, I'm not saying we can do it during this administration, then let's actually get to an immigration system that works and that can create the most just system for the most people.
And Rabbi, over our history, we've also asked a word you didn't use, like what kind of refugees to be let in. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act here in California and nationally, I think for many years. The immigrants into Ellis Island, people started talking about, oh, those awful Italians coming in, any Southern Europeans. In 1965, the law was changed, and you had family migration, which brought in people from other parts of the world, including Asia. So that question of what kind of immigrants to let in is one that I think the message of this administration has been saying, what kind of immigrants we're kicking out, the worst of the worst, and then just casting a way too wide net on that particular point. How does that engage in the discussion? I know it's something that's a matter of law, but it's also a matter of ethics.
For sure. And something that I hear often, sometimes even from people in the Jewish community, is, well, my family came in legally. And that may or may not be true, but the laws have changed. So, like you said, the first group that was excluded from the United States were Chinese immigrants. And then there were lots of people coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, including the large wave of Jews who came, first the German Jews who came in the late 19th century. There were Jews here, of course, from very early on, from the colonial period, but there was a wave of Germans who came after the revolutions. There from the middle of the 19th century on, and then, of course, a wave of Eastern European Jews who came mostly at the beginning of the 20th century. My own family came around 1901 to this country from, well, Lithuania, Ukraine, though sometimes the borders changed, but that general part of the world. And then in 1924, a law passed that was specifically about keeping out Jews and Italians and other undesirables. And in fact, during the Holocaust, there was a bill that was proposed that would have brought in, I believe, 10,000 or 20,000, I can't remember, Jewish children, Jewish like children, refugees from Nazi Germany. And it didn't pass. And the voices against it said things like, well, basically, these Jewish children are going to grow up to be Jewish adults and they're going to destroy American culture. And it's the exact same language that we hear now about immigrants. And certainly there's particularly prejudice against non-white immigrants. And it's, the groups that that this language is directed against change according to the decade and the century, but it's the exact same language. There were all sorts of smears of Jewish immigrants that they were bringing in disease. We hear exactly the same language now. The idea that immigrants are going to change the culture of this country in a negative way. It's exactly the same language. It just has adapted to people coming from different countries.
Here's maybe best news, Pat, if you don't mind, just briefly. Just as the rabbi was saying, the hate toward immigrants has been sort of remarkably similar over the decades and centuries, right? No Irish need apply, all the nasty stuff about Italians, about Jews. And we've seen similar nastiness in recent decades about Latino and Asian immigrants. The best research that we have, and I recommend a book called Streets of Gold that looks at a huge amount of data over the last few decades, suggests that the trajectory of immigrants in the last several decades, and by definition, we don't have research about the last 5 or 10 years because you can't really study a trajectory, but over the last several decades, the trajectory of immigrants who were overwhelmingly Latino and Asian, it looks remarkably similar to the trajectory of immigrants from that earlier era, the late 19th and early 20th century. So just as back then, people said the immigrants won't be able to assimilate, the immigrants aren't like us, the immigrants are ruining the country, and the immigrants did very well. We're again seeing that in recent decades, the immigrants who've come here are the immigrants who come, if they're poor, often remain poor through their lives, but their children do better and their grandchildren do even better. Their grandchildren basically, in economic ways, don't look that different from people whose grandparents were born in the United States. That is a profoundly encouraging thing to say at a time when there's so much to be worried about immigrants. The immigrants who've come in recent decades have faced a lot of barriers and a lot of hate, and just like their predecessors, despite all their differences in name and origin, have done extremely well. And for anyone who wants to go in much more depth on this, it's by a Princeton economist named Leah Bustan and a Stanford economist named Ram Abramitsky. They studied census records and income and all kinds of things. It's just a fascinating book.
And that's true in their political views too.
Yes, please go ahead, Miguel.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I think, the patterns of assimilation are consistent from one group to the next. But I think what we should all be concerned about, I think what we should be focused on is that core fundamental American values and principles are now at question. And I think certainly in my lifetime, that has never been the case to this level of degree, where it has been normalized to see people masked, literally picking up someone on a street corner who is waiting for a bus and simply taking them away and disappearing them. We through our grantees, we talk to families who have been impacted, and we had a group of families who had their loved one disappeared, and that not being dramatic in using that language, they have literally been disappeared, where a third of them had no idea where their loved one is, and those who did know uh, reported back that their loved one had been moved multiple times to different parts of the country intentionally, where they didn't have access to an attorney, they didn't have access to their family, and in some cases, as you stated at the beginning, had been shipped off to a foreign country. I heard of one case today where someone was sent to Africa who came from Latin America. And so we're entering into a new era here as a nation, and it's something that as all Americans we should be concerned about. So even if you believe that strongly that we should end all immigration, which by the way, the border has never been more secure than it's been today. It's pretty much impossible to cross over. So for those who argue we're not going to do any form of immigration reform until the border is secure, well, that is today. It's literally impossible to cross over. I don't think most Americans will consider that we should engage in this type of enforcement at any cost, at the level of diluting our fundamental American values that we have cherished as fundamentally, from making sure that states control who patrols their streets, to ensuring that people have access to their attorneys, to making sure that people have the ability to go through a process and have a level of predictability that is fair and reasonable.
Which we've seen as well, that the Trump administration has been firing immigration judges, the people who are qualified to sit in judgment on these cases, and putting in essentially unqualified people who agree politically with the Trump administration, but whose knowledge of immigration law is virtually non-existent. I'd like to just get a quick follow-up too with Miguel. To what extent do you think that deliberate misinformation or just misinformation is contributing to this? Because you see online debates all the while, like, we have to get rid of all the immigrants. Well, if you do, then you're going to be paying $15 for a head of lettuce instead of $5. You have the administration talking about murders committed by people who are in this country illegally, who are in fact the worst of the worst, and using that as a blanket excuse to go after other people. And so just a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding from people who are people of goodwill, who just don't understand how this works, to the invisibility in a lot of ways of immigrant labor, and to the good and to the bad, as what David was pointing out. And I also want to say you're getting terrific questions coming in for us. We'll be getting to them in a couple of minutes. If you want to put your question in the Q&A box for panelists, we'll get to as many as we can. So Miguel, I'm sorry, please.
Sure. So the misinformation is daily, almost on an hourly basis. Just in the debate around shutting down the federal government, where the Democrats are making it about healthcare. The Republican talking point is about the fact that Democrats are fighting for the undocumented having access to healthcare that is funded by the federal government. The undocumented are ineligible to receive health care that is federally funded. That has always been the case. And so that is just a basic fact that isn't correct. There is so much misinformation that the undocumented do not pay taxes, when in fact the undocumented pay taxes. In California alone, they pay almost $24 billion in federal, state, and local taxes every year. And they also pay Social Security tax that they do not access. They do not have the ability to benefit from a Social Security system that they pay into. And so from the fundamentals of that to the very fundamentals about why this is a problem from the first place, using crime as the framework, arguing that the undocumented are contributing to the crime in cities and throughout the country, when we know this, the stats are very clear that immigrants commit crimes at a much lesser rate than native born Americans. And so the facts are in direct contrast to the rhetoric that's being used to justify the use of this type of force, the undermining our core principal values as Americans, and at a very significant cost. So now it's we've created an environment where people don't know what the real facts are, when in fact the opposite is often true from what is being said.
So David, Leonhardt, our question from Jim echoes what it was that Miguel was just saying. He said, immigrants who work pay taxes, so aren't they an essential part of the workforce as well as contributors to generated taxes? And this is one of the fundamental real debates, not are they getting Medicare or not, but one of the fundamental questions that divides parties and points of view.
Yes, and the Trump administration is lying when they say the Democrats are doing the shutdown to give healthcare to illegal immigrants. So immigration has big benefits. I want to emphasize that. I think the thing that I'm objecting to is often in many of the settings where I appear, right, at universities, at think tanks, people then take the notion that immigration has big benefits and extend it to suggest that it's only benefits, that there are no losers, that it's in everyone's interest to have very high immigration. And I just think that's not the case. So I mentioned a historical example earlier, the time where we've had biggest shrinking inequality and largest wage gains for lower and middle income Americans was the period in the last century when we had very low immigration. I mentioned the doctor's example. If you want to go take a look at the 2017 National Academy of Science report on the effects of immigration, they basically looked at this was a top tier panel. They basically looked at every study that had tried to look at the effect of immigration on wages of the people who are already here. I've cited this number in print. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting it now, but it's something like there are 21 results in their main table and 15 of them are negative, which is to say immigration does tend to reduce wages for the workers who are already there, and the effects are disproportionately on lower income workers. Now, the effects aren't huge, but they're also not nothing. And to say to lower income workers, hey, your wages are going to go down a little bit, but you should be happy about it. I think there's sort of a paternalism about that. And so what I really want to try, I think that the immigration policies of the Biden years have helped lead us into this Trump era, which I consider so damaging. Immigration during the Biden administration was net close to 10 million people entering the country. That's the highest level in American history. It's higher than the peak of the Ellis Island years in terms of sheer numbers of people. If you want to look
legally or illegally, or do you know?
both, it's both. It's both. It sort of doesn't distinguish between the two. It's both. So if you want to Google Biden immigration surge New York Times, you'll see the story we did on this with data from the Congressional Budget Office. So what we experienced during the Biden years was really unlike anything that we'd experienced in this country, certainly in our living memories. And I think when we come out of this Trump period, not only but to come out of it, we have to be more realistic about immigration. And we also have to take the concerns that Americans have about it more seriously. If you want to hear a deeply chilling poll number today, many of the people watching tonight probably know that Donald Trump's immigration policies are no longer popular with most Americans. Most Americans say they disapprove of Donald Trump's immigration policies. They think they've gone too far. And thank goodness, because they have gone way too far. If you ask Americans today which country they trust more in immigration, Republicans have a large lead over Democrats.
In spite of that.
In spite of that. So that is American voters, or at least most of them, saying some version of, we really don't like what Donald Trump is doing, but we don't consider Democrats to be credible on this issue because of what we watched them do the last time they had power. And I think we both need to address the emergency that is the Trump administration's lawless, oppressive approach to immigration. And we need to get to a point where the Democratic Party is less disdainful of public opinion on immigration, is more willing to have the kind of border policy, and yes, even the deportation policy that Barack Obama and Bill Clinton had. That was much more popular with Americans. than the sheer level of immigration that we saw during the Biden administration. And that's why I emphasize both halves of this. If if
I'm
the
sorry, go
only
ahead.
options Americans have are this horrific Trump policy or the Biden policy, many of them will choose the Trump policy.
In a minute, I
What,
have a question to, oh, I'm sorry, Miguel, can you make it quick and we can move
Sure.
on?
Where I would go further to David's point, I think it is partly immigration where there's a disconnect, but I think the bigger issue is a disconnect to working people, period. And where the attitudes around immigration is one of many points where the left is often not connected to, not empathetic towards, or simply doesn't even understand.
I know I should just get a button that says I agree with Miguel, but I agree with
Okay.
Miguel.
So Rabbi Jacobs, what we've also seen is that the demonstrations, the people who've turned out to protest the ICE tactics and the people they're collecting, a lot of it gets generated when it's your barber who gets picked up, when it's the lunch lady in your kid's cafeteria, that the abstract isn't getting to people as much as the concrete is. What do you think of that as kind of a moral suasion effort?
Yeah, that is definitely true. And I'm thinking of, I know one synagogue where the custodian was detained and the whole synagogue rallied and rallied many of their legal resources. And thank God he is out and back to his job and back to his community and his family. But not everybody who's getting detained is that lucky or has a connected community that can rally around them. Um, Look, I think that it's very natural, right? We can't care equally. We know this. We can't care equally about everyone in the world, right? Normally, our concentric circles of care start with our family, our close friends, our community, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that when you're talking about immigrants in general as kind of this faceless blob, right? It's hard to care about people in general, but you care very much where it's a member of your community. And I think that it is really important to tell these stories and to talk about how members of our community are being picked up and detained without due process and to tell the stories of what's happening to them. I don't think it's a failing that people care more about people they know and they care about. I think that's something that we can build on and help people think about immigrants, not just, like I said, as kind of a faceless group of people, but as this particular person in your community who you have a relationship with and who you are invested in making sure that they stay safe.
Have you heard that, Rabbi Jacobs, from people that, gee, I didn't realize what was going on until something happened to my barber, to the cafeteria lunch lady?
Oh, absolutely. And I think particularly when you're reading the paper and you see, if I'm sitting in New York and I see something's happening in LA or Texas or any place else, it doesn't feel so personal. But of course, once it becomes personal, once it becomes about your barber, your kid's friend, then it's a very different situation.
Let's take a question from Nikki, who's watching us. And she says, when is the government going to pass new legislation to upgrade our laws and make the path to citizenship easier? Just carting off these people is unlawful, painful, and bad for us and our image abroad. The money should be used to build more legal places to come through to expedite the process, not on ice. And Mr. Miguel Santana, I'm sure this is the song that you're singing as well, but at this moment, the idea of expanding the paths to citizenship doesn't seem very likely.
Well, the government can't even work at this point, can't even meet and function. So let alone adopt comprehensive immigration reform. The conversation is not even being had. It's by either side, frankly. It's not just one party that's to blame here. It is one side's afraid to touch it, the other side refuses to touch it, and I think that is why where we are today is a complete denial that we have a system that is dysfunctional, that is not working, and the lack of real leadership and courage to take on your own side, oftentimes requiring it. It's not an accident that major immigration reform was led by Republican presidents, where they had to lead their own side. George Bush tried to do it and was unsuccessful because he wasn't able to convince his own side to do it. And so I think that, but that's where we come in. That's where we as Americans have the ability to make our concerns raised. And one thing that I'm hopeful is that now that we're seeing it play out, now that we're seeing everyone's rights violated, and we're witnessing the cruelty and the lack of basic humanity playing out as it is, that as a broader community, we will insist that Congress and the White House take this issue on and engage in comprehensive immigration reform.
And David, the politics, as you've written about, are really a tangle. And what you wrote took me aback that in Denmark, the Liberal Party, which would be sort of democratic here, but much more liberal, gained support by standard liberal programs, but an opposition to a lot of immigration, to more immigration. And I think of some of these countries as more homogeneous in their demographics than the United States. And so that may be part of the factor, but I was still taken aback that here's a liberal party that was also against immigration and maybe certain kinds of immigrants.
So, yes. And obviously, Scandinavia and Denmark have differences with the United States. However, I would say that the politics of immigration in the wealthy world are actually more similar than different across the wealthy world. And it even extends to some countries that are not so wealthy. I mentioned South Africa as a country that has had a whole bunch of immigration issues roiling its politics. And by the way, both folks on the side of that are the same race in South Africa. Both the people who are upset about the level of immigration are Black, and the arrivals are Black in South Africa. And so I think that relates to something that I think is important, which is if you look at country after country, we have had a really big increase in immigration in the 21st century. The United States, we have more of a history of immigration, and we came earlier with that. But the percentages in Europe are just really, really striking. I mean, many countries in Europe had single-digit percentage of foreign-born population, and they've just gone way, way up. So Sweden, Germany, the UK, a whole bunch of these countries are now approaching 20%. And in country after country, you have seen some version of this story play out, in which the voters in that country are uncomfortable with this level of immigration. And for lack of a better term, political elites, politicians, journalists, academics have ignored those concerns for quite a long time. And not just ignored them, but said that they're ignorant or said that they're inherently racist. And to be clear, some of the concerns are indeed racist. But I don't think it's the fundamental thing going on. And so what we have seen in country after country is we have seen the voters rebel. They've said, wait a second, if the center right and the center left aren't going to listen to us on immigration policy, and they're going to just keep allowing it to increase and increase, even though we're saying enough, we're going to vote for the only party that is willing to do something about it. And that's why you've seen the far right grow so much in so many European countries. The far right has a chance to win the next elections in both France and Britain. Depending how you define the far right, it's already controls Italy. It's very large in Sweden. It's very large in Germany. And what's interesting about Denmark, and that's why I went there and spent time there last year and wrote this magazine story about it, is that in Denmark, the center left rediscovered an old tradition of the center left. Pat, you mentioned it when you mentioned Cesar Chavez earlier. The view of the left used to be, hey, immigration is good, but it has to be in moderation, because otherwise it's going to be a gift to corporations and it's going to undercut labor unions and undercut wages. Civil rights leaders were skeptical of immigration. Unions were skeptical of immigration, not just Cesar Chavez, but other unions as well. And so what you have seen in Denmark is this very progressive party, a party that's expanded abortion rights and been really aggressive on climate and done things to crack down on big finance speculators in real estate, the kind of things that American liberals would love, has done all those things, but they have also said, hey, we hear you And we are not going to let this level of immigration continue, and we're going to be much tougher on it. And the far right in Denmark has been marginalized, and the center left continues to govern. And I just don't see a way forward for mainstream political parties that don't take some version of respectful treatment of voters' real uncomfort with the pace and scale of recent immigration. And that's why I think Denmark, although it's different, is really such an interesting case study.
Let me go first to Rabbi Jacobs and then to Miguel Santana, because Rabbi, this seems like a sort of a cognitive dissonance thing. If you are liberal, humane, and all those other qualities, you want to welcome immigrants, especially so many immigrants who come from those countries where they are being persecuted for religious beliefs, political beliefs, or just whatever part of the population demographically they belong to. And yet, as we were just hearing from David Leonhardt, there's a sense that, well, but this has kind of backfired, that we've reached a limit on this. Are you hearing this dissonance as well?
Yeah, so to relate to what David said and also what I said before, I think there's a difference between saying, well, let's just have open borders, right? Open borders everywhere in the world, and we're not going to have immigration policies anymore. There's a lot of space between that and what's happening now, which is nobody can come in this country, at least. And I think that we have to ask the questions about how do we create a just policy that accounts for some of what David mentioned in terms of making sure that that everybody is able to earn a decent living, and also that we fulfill our obligations toward people who are seeking refuge. Every previous administration has had some number. For a long time it was 125,000 slots for asylum seekers, which of course is never enough to really accommodate the number of asylum seekers, but it's certainly a lot more than zero. And so I think those are the questions we have to ask. And as everyone said, we're nowhere near having a real conversation about comprehensive immigration policy. There are a lot of extremely thoughtful people and immigration organizations thinking about it, but those are the questions when we get hopefully some different administration that we need to ask ourselves is how do we create an immigration policy that allows people who are already here path to citizenship, that allows for people who are seeking asylum to come into the United States, and that people can come in through legal pathways, which is what most people want to do. But that is very different than saying, let's just throw out any immigration policy whatsoever, and let's just have no laws whatsoever.
Miguel, how does that make you think when you hear David talking about successful liberal parties whose success in Europe, at least, is in part in saying no to more, to expanded, to extensive immigration? And how do you tease that out from being logical about economic questions versus racist and xenophobic sensibilities that, of course, we've seen underlying the Trump administration policies?
Well, our version of that is inaction. So I think that the failure of the Democrats when they were in power, having both houses and the White House to adopt comprehensive immigration reform is, in essence, making a statement all into itself. And even on things where there is clear consensus nationally, like, for example, on Dreamers, people who were brought to this country as children, who are now adults, who are doctors, nurses, educators, attorneys, who are fully integrated into American society, contributing to our economy, contributing they're your neighbors, educating our kids, providing a huge benefit for all of us, who still go to sleep at night with the uncertainty of their status being revoked. And so even to bring a resolution to that group of people where there is a clear consensus in the country, every poll shows that people understand that the case of Dreamers is something that we need to settle. Both parties have failed to meet that and take action on that. So I think in this country, I think one side is too afraid to lead and has allowed this level of chaos to basically exist of a consistent broken system over decades. And now what we have is a situation where the only response that we have is one that is taking a very blunt instrument that is deteriorating our basic civil rights as a country, and is taking us in a very scary place as a nation. And I think that the failure of leadership on both sides has contributed to the situation that we are in now.
David, is this where you push your I agree with Miguel button?
Yes, it is. Look, I think I think that that people who are in favor of what has often been called comprehensive immigration reform, and people who are in favor of a more just and humane system. So that means allowing so many of the dreamers to become citizens. It means creating legal pathways for people who are not yet here and want to apply to come. It means continuing to be a beacon to people who are fleeing the risk of death or injury in another country immediately. I think if you are in favor of all those things, and I am, you also have to be in favor with the kinds of things that most Americans also want and that will be necessary to pass it. So that is tough border security. And I know many defenders of the Biden administration said they did that. Well, they did it in the last 6 months of their administration, and they tried to pass a bill in the last 6 months of their administration, and Donald Trump cynically killed it. But the Biden administration did almost none of that in the first 3 years. They expanded parole, they expanded asylum, they tried to pause deep over the most rapid immigration in American history. So I think people who want the good stuff, as they would phrase it, really also have to be in favor of real border security, of rapid decisions on people who come, which is fair to them. And if those people do not qualify for asylum, they should be deported quickly. It is much more just to say to someone, we're sorry, we can't take everyone who wants to come here. We can't take most people who want to come here. You don't qualify for asylum. You must leave now. It is much less just to say to that person, spend 5 or 7 years waiting in the country, and then we might kick you out at the end of it.
So David, I have a question, if I can. I need to push
Yeah,
to
please.
David because our time is beginning to wind down. It seems like a very wise question from Ellen. And then I'd like to go to Rabbi Jacobs about it. Ellen wants to know whether you can address the failures in parts of Europe to encourage assimilation from the Muslim population into the third generation. She says, I think many Americans see this failure as something that could happen here, which is the opposite of what we like to think of in this country. So David, if you could address that quickly. And then I want to ask the assimilation question to Rabbi Jacobs as well.
I'll do it very quickly. I don't think it's going to happen here. So, as I already mentioned, assimilation here is an overwhelmingly positive story, whether it's Jews and Italians and Irish from 100 and 150 years ago, or whether it's Asian Americans and Latinos from the last 60 years. The assimilation machine in the United States doesn't work for everyone, but overall it continues to work
But
incredibly.
to flip her question, has it contributed to anti-immigration sentiment in Europe of the kind you're seeing, for example?
Europe has a harder problem than us. Europe has a harder problem than us. Assimilation is less common in Europe. It is particularly less common in heavily Muslim neighborhoods and communities of Europe. I don't envy just how difficult that problem is in Europe. I do not expect it. The question was, will that spread to the United States? I do not expect it to spread to the United States. If you just look at a globe and think about where people live, I don't think we're going to have anywhere near the level of immigration from the Middle East and North Africa and other heavily Muslim countries that Europe has had.
And Rabbi Jacobs, constantly over history, we see this question of assimilation and otherness and apartness being used against Jews. And I think it's one of the underlying fears here, but as David said, there's very little to fear. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, there was an attempt during the Holocaust to bring in refugee Jewish children, and the response was, well, they're just going to grow up to be adults and they're going to ruin the culture of the United States. And we've heard that language over and over about the culture that immigrants are bringing in. And as David said, what happens generation after generation is their children and certainly their grandchildren grow up and hopefully, I mean, speaking as a rabbi and somebody who wants people to hold on to their culture, I don't want people to meld into the so-called melting pot. right? But we become Americans and bring different cultures and different backgrounds into America, and second, third generations really are able to thrive and succeed. Also, first generations are able to thrive and succeed in this country, but certainly that's more and more true as the generations go on. So I'm not in the business of fortune telling. I'm not gonna make predictions. I'm not gonna predict um, you know, what might happen sometime in the future, but we can look back in the past and we can say that these fears are the same ones that have been said about every group of immigrants. And we've seen over and over that, in fact, immigrants and their children, their grandchildren become Americans.
Miguel,
But if I could just add, the one thing that does worry me for the children that are experiencing trauma at this point, that are seeing their parents afraid to go outside, who are having to literally leave school to work so that their parents could be safe, who are being asked by ICE to report their own parents if they're undocumented. That level of trauma is going to be very deep, and it's going to create um, huge impacts for them as they grow as adults. And I don't know what the outcome is going to be in future generations for those young people as they grow into adults, where they feel that they don't belong in this country, and that they, no matter what they do, what kind of education they receive, how hard they work, that they could never be American. And that worries me.
And Miguel, I'd like you to pick up about something that David was talking about how eventually wages will rise, job opportunities will rise if people who are doing these jobs at lower wages sometimes illegally take them. And we have a lot of questions from viewers like Jeff saying, look, the economic challenges, we have people who are retiring, who have no children. We have healthcare workers who are doing a job that it seems no one else will be doing, certainly at those wages. Again, the question of wages, that's a long-term thing. Who will be picking the crops in the field that nobody now is going to be in a position, certainly at those wages, from native-born Americans to be taking? So can you take David's premise and spin it out a little about where you think it's going?
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing it here in LA play itself out in real time. I think we're seeing restaurants close. We're seeing work sites shut down. In talking to fire survivors who are trying to rebuild their homes and lives, are having challenges finding workers. 60% of construction workers in California are immigrants. And so I think that it is I don't disagree about the wage, the consistent issue that David raises about the impact on wages. And at the same time, immigrants are a very integrated part of our economy. And Californians understand that the number one issue Californians raise in every single poll is the cost of living. And the reason why Californians at 70%, 80% are so outraged by why they're seeing is, yes, they're concerned about the humanitarian impact, but they understand that it's going to result in bigger costs for them, and everything from food to healthcare costs to construction costs across the board. And so it is a very significant issue, certainly in California and around the country.
David, can you speak just really quickly, because we're about to do our wrap-up round? And by the way, you can find a link to David's article, to some of the books he mentioned, and to other programs for helping immigrants. If you'd like to help, like go to court with people, you can find those. We have them posted as well. So David, just really quickly, that idea of ideally we'll get to that point where you talk about where wages are higher for these jobs that are made available to American citizens and legal residents. But what about that gap in between, the 3, 5, 10, 20 years where we may not have enough healthcare workers, we may not have enough farm workers?
We may not, but the phrase that the wages that are being offered is a really important phrase, right? And so I just again want to emphasize immigration isn't a free lunch. One of the ways it holds down prices is by holding down wages. Corporate executives understand that, which is why they're in favor of such high immigration. And so there's no free lunch here. With less immigration, we're going to have higher wages and higher prices. And with more immigration, we're going to have lower wages and lower prices. Now, I think our economy needs high levels of immigration, substantial levels of immigration over the next few decades, not as high as we just had during the Biden administration, but there's no free lunch. And I just think that's really important to keep in mind. I think that's also why you see some of the biggest backlash politically was in the communities that were on the front lines of this. Just look at how far South Texas shifted away from Democrats. Those were people who were experiencing the immigration. The same is true on the west and south side of Chicago. The same is true in Queens. And they said, whoo, we don't like what we're seeing, and they abandon the Democrats. And so there isn't a free lunch here.
All right, so we'll get to our final wrap-up questions now, whereas everybody who watches this program knows we're trying to end on a positive note. And one thing that's frustrated people is they'd like to help on this immigration matter. They don't know what to do. So we have some links and information. HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, started more than 100 years ago to help Jews resettle fleeing Eastern Europe. There's a link to that work and what it's been able to do and what it is being able to do now. And Rabbi Jacobs, you have your organization as well has some ideas, some suggestions for people.
Thanks. So I hear this question a lot. People are just feeling so overwhelmed at everything that's happening and feeling like I almost paralyzed by I don't know what to do because I can't do everything. And my response is just do anything, literally anything. Pick something in your town, in your city, whether it is volunteering with an organization that's working with immigrants, whether it's if you have the stomach for it, accompanying people to detention hearings, which as we heard, they might be detained, and it's horrific to watch that. If you HIAS has a program, as I mentioned before, where people can create a welcoming circle to even to help to settle a refugee, which is a pretty big time and money commitment, right? But there's a lot of different things that people can do in your community. And so I would say just start by asking people in your local neighborhood, in your town, what organizations they know, check to see what's on different organizations' web pages, and just pick one thing and do it. It's not, you can get really paralyzed by trying to figure out the most impactful thing, but we actually need people to do everything. And also it can also just be local volunteering in a food pantry or right, people have, I mean, the economic needs are astronomical right now. And so really anything that we do to try to build a more loving community is going to help. And especially I'd say in a moment when our social bonds are really broken, when there's a sense out there that I think was really exacerbated during COVID, and Trump is working on making it even worse of I just take care of myself. I don't care about you. I don't care about anybody else in my community. That some of what we can do is just take care of each other.
That's very optimistic and hopeful. And we do have links to a lot of those programs that you can engage with to support either with contributions or with volunteerism. You can find those. Next, for our optimistic wrap up, let's give a minute to David Leonhardt.
Thank you, Pat. So look, I've described in multiple ways how broken the politics of this have been over the last decade. But I do think there's really an opportunity going forward, or there will be one. Donald Trump's policies, which are unjust and I think in many cases illegal, are already producing a backlash. Americans don't like them. You can see that in the polls. They elected him in part to deal with the border, but now they don't like the way he's dealing with immigration. On the Democratic side, as I've already described, I think Democrats went way too far in the post-Obama years toward a much too lax immigration policy that Americans did not want. And although there's not enough introspection among the Democratic Party, there is some. Senator Ruben Gallego of Arizona has offered a bill. It's not going to pass now. It's quite moderate and thoughtful. Representative Gabe Vasquez, I believe of New Mexico, has offered a bill. Similarly, quite thoughtful. And so I can imagine a world in which Donald Trump's policies produce a backlash. Meanwhile, Democrats look at their own policy and say, wow, it really feels like the Barack Obama administration got this administration, and that what you could end up with again is the kind of coalition, and no, it never worked before, but the kind of coalition that got very close to passing comprehensive immigration reform before. And I really think it could happen. And I would just encourage people, don't lose hope because it hasn't happened yet. Healthcare reform didn't happen under Harry Truman. It didn't happen under Richard Nixon. It didn't happen under Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. And then it did happen under Barack Obama. And so I think comprehensive immigration reform can happen. I actually think most Americans want a very reasonable, balanced policies, and we shouldn't give up hope that eventually our political system will produce the bill that I think is both for the most part just and fair, and is what the polls say most Americans, including most immigrants, want.
Okay, thank you. And I'll give, because he's in my time zone, I'm going to give the last word to Miguel Santana.
Well, I agree, and I'm a big believer that most Americans are fair, are wise, and have big hearts, and believe in our core American values, and are concerned about what they're saying, and are generous. And we saw it during the wildfires here in Los Angeles, where the world and Americans came together to support Los Angeles. In our foundation, we had 84,000 individual donors who gave to support Angelenos. It was a huge expression of love for survivors here in LA. And we're seeing it again during what's happening in Los Angeles. We've started a fund to support families who have lost a loved one due to a deportation, often to support children who are now having a struggle and having U.S.-born children in most cases. And we encourage folks to be part of an effort to help each other. And
that website link for people as well.
Yeah, just put on the
website.
About
10 seconds left. I'm sorry.
No problem. And I remain optimistic.
Thank you, all three of you, so much. I think this has been one of the most inspiring and challenging at the same time discussions that we've had here. So I hope that people will look at the links, the information you've provided, and the opportunities for volunteerism and support that you have provided. And also you can look to see what programs we have coming up. Thank you all three as well for being here. So generous with your time and much appreciated. Thanks very much. And I'm Pat Morrison, and I thank all of you for watching this evening.